Okay, I am going to go ahead and start us off with some technology information. Good morning and welcome to this TA session. My name is Molly Cook with the Illinois Center for Specialized Professional Support at Illinois State University. And I am joined here today with Sarah Blaylock and Kenneth Williams, and we will be talking about Grants 101. If you have questions as this webinar proceeds, please post them in the Q&A or chat box, and we'll be sure to address them at the end of the webinar or throughout. A reminder that this webinar is recorded. The presentation, recording, and any materials presented today will be available on the Illinois WorkNet website within 48 hours. In an effort to be as accessible as possible, this webinar will be offering closed captioning, as well as the recorded sessions will offer closed captioning. A reminder that if you have a faulty internet connection or would prefer to call in, you can do so by calling into this webinar using the phone number in your original registration email. So with that, let's go ahead and do some introductions. I'm Molly Cook. As I mentioned, I work with the Illinois Center for Specialized Professional Support, and I'm really passionate about grants and grant writing based on my former experiences working as a development director at a homeless shelter and just working as a grant writing consultant. So I'm really excited to talk with you all today about the grant writing process.
Good morning. I'm Kenneth Williams, new to this state of Illinois, but I'm bringing to the table for grants information about 30 years of community-based organization work, including writing grants as well as reviewing grants. So I'm extremely excited to see hopefully some first-time grantees learning the process here today.
And hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Blaylock. I'm DCEO's Office of Employment Training Grant Manager Intern, and I've been a part of the NOFO creation process and now the grant review process. So I bring kind of a novice view to the table. And we're going to go ahead with the agenda.
So today we're going to be talking about everything from the grant life cycle to identifying grant opportunities, writing your applications for the grant opportunities that you find, submitting your applications and resources. And we'll be talking about some tips and tricks along the way for each phase of the process. I want to start just by doing some introductions. And this is something we can do in the chat. And these introductions there's two purposes. The first is just so that we can get to know one another who's here today. And the second is to practice describing what your organization or agency does and what your mission is in a concise way, because that's really a large part of writing an application and submitting a narrative for a grant proposal. So as you'll see on the slide, if you could take a moment to type in the chat, let us know who you are and what your organization does, what population you serve, or what the mission of your organization is. So I'll go ahead and type mine in the chat as well and give you all about a minute or so to do the same. This is good that I'm typing too, because I can guess how long it might take you, because it's taking me a second to think. Okay. I see someone private messaged me, so I'll go ahead and if you want to type that into everyone, your introduction, that would be great. Okay. So I just put mine in the chat. Feel free to continue updating with your introductions as we go. Would love to see those and love to see who's on. So please feel free to do that. And as you do, we will proceed to the next slide. Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk about is the grant life cycle. So there are several different steps in looking for grants and applying to grants, and this picture demonstrates them. We first have the pre-award phase. So this is when you notice a funding opportunity. You see one that's announced that you think might be a good fit. So you look through and learn the steps in the application process, and you yourself apply. And then there's an application review process once you submit your completed application to the funding agency, where they assign various reviewers to review your application. We next move into the award phase. So this is once you have submitted your application, the committee thinks you're wonderful, and they decide that you should get the funding. What happens here is that the reviewers share their recommendations, and once they determine who will be awarded, there are a series of forms that are given to the agency that's received the funding. You might receive forms like a program risk assessment, a notice of state funding award, that's what NOSA is, and a grant agreement form. So it's basically just describing that you're going to spend the funding in the way that the funder intended and that you described in your grant application. So you take this funding and you implement some amazing programs, and then most grant funding is time limited. So let's say your funding is for 12 to 18 months. At the end of that 12 to 18 months, you'll move into the post-award phase. So you'll do some reporting to the funder regarding the results of your programs or activities. You potentially will have an audit where the funders come in and look at some of the work you've done, look at your records, and then you'll close out the grant and do anything that remains. Now, if you want to dive into additional information on any of these parts of the grant process, there is a great website that I'm going to put in the chat right now. It's on Illinois WorkNet, and it's a Grants 101 page. So there's also some checklists and resources on this page. So I'd encourage you on your own time, if you want to learn more, to click on this website and do a deep dive. I also see in the chat we had two folks introduce themselves. Welcome. I see we have Lesia here from Prairie State College, interested in grant information for demographics of a majority of minority students. Very interesting. Thank you so much for sharing. And then I see we have Joy here as well from Wren Lake College, working in apprenticeships and CTE support. Great. Well, welcome so much, and thanks for introducing yourselves. And then David Ellis, thank you so much, with DHS Employment and Training.
All right, well, welcome everyone. I'm going to go over some key terms that are maybe familiar to you and maybe they're new, but they're pretty prevalent within the grant writing world. So the first one is award. And an award is the financial assistance that provides support or stimulation to accomplish a public purpose. So that's the goal, right? Then we have budget, the financial plan for the project or program. And Kenneth will talk more about that in a little bit. We have the close date, and this is a deadline designated by the grant making agency. That's a very important one to remember and know. We have a data universal numbering system, or a DUNS number, and that's a 9-digit number established and assigned by the Dun and Bradstreet Incorporated to uniquely identify entities. I know our GATA session went into that more in-depthly, so that's going to be on Illinois WorkNet as well if you need more information on that specifically. We have eligible entities, and that's any entity that qualifies to apply for the grant or to be helped by the grant. A funding period is the period of time when funding is available for obligation by the recipient. A grant agreement is a legal instrument of financial assistance between the funder and grantee. A non-federal entity is a state, local government, Indian tribe, institution of higher education, or nonprofit organization. Project cost is a total allowable cost incurred by an award, and that's going to be discussed in the budget section of this presentation. A project period is the period established in an award document during which awarding agency sponsorship begins and ends. And that's kind of what Molly just went over. Target population, the population that the NOFO or applicant has identified as being the target of programming. And a NOFO is the notice of funding opportunity. And if you need more help kind of navigating an uncertain term, the grants.gov is where we got this information, and they have a pretty expansive list of more grant terms. We're going to go into step 1, the pre-writing phase.
So the first thing to think about, especially for entities who are writing or hoping to get funded for the first time, is why do this? Obviously, the main issue is trying to receive funding, but figuring out what grants you apply for and what you might do with them is what all of this Grants 101 is about. And it's the thing that people forget, that first step sometimes. When you think about what a grant can do, it can do multiple purposes for your agency or your entity. One thing we love, if the funder approves it, is that a grant can provide seed money for new projects. Let's say you're an agency or an organization that's been doing great work in one area, but you want to do something new. Hopefully within the same field, something you can show that you're able to do it. And as we go through this whole presentation, we'll keep coming back to some recurring themes, and that's demonstrating your ability. But seed money to start up something new that serves you or your community. It can also support essential operations. A lot of, especially small entities, are struggling just to get by. So essential operations can be covered by some grants. It can allow you to grow. You're doing something great, but you know you could do more. Get some more funding to do it better and bigger. It can also meet agency and community needs. One thing that I've talked about in these other grants 101 is there was a time during another economic crisis when many community-based organizations in my community, the Chicagoland area, were shutting down. And entities that were able to keep functioning were able to reach out and get funding to support and fill in the gaps from the other agencies that closed. So filling in those community needs is something that a lot of funders are really happy to provide funding for. It can enhance program accountability and impacts. Let's talk about that and the last bullet point together, providing credibility to an agency or a project. By showing that you can monitor and use a grant effectively, you can adhere to the guidelines that the funder puts out, you can follow the goals that you set up for yourself. It can really help you stay on track to be accountable with your program and to demonstrate and really see, are you hitting what you said you were hoping to hit? Are you making that community impact? But that last part, the credibility, if you get funding from one funder, other funding providers might say, oh, I see they're able to do this. It gives you some credibility. It gives you some recognition that I hate to use the word worthwhile or able, but that you're a good fit to get more funding from them in the future. But that word fit is really important. Don't go after funding just to get the money. The old term we like to use is don't chase the funds. Make sure that the funds support what you and your community need, and make sure that you're fitting what the funder wants. Don't chase the dollars, but make sure the fit is right. So different places you can look for funding opportunities. And again, this Grants 101 is hopefully designed for people who either need to get a little better at submitting grant applications, or for some of us who are new at submitting grant apps. So some good places to find out where you might be able to find funding are through some state and federal government entities. The one thing that's really getting popularity during this economic crisis are foundation grants, community, private, family, just private grant makers in general. The foundation and private grants are often an area where you can receive discretionary funding rather than program specific. And when we're talking about discretionary funding, it really is exactly what it sounds like. The funds are more at your discretion to do with what you need. You may not be quite as tied into a specific track or a thought process that the funder has. You might be able to be more flexible and use your discretionary funds for things that you know you need only for your entity or your community. There are a couple of really good websites to check out where some grant opportunities are. DonorBox and grants.gov both have links to additional resources, but they're two big ones where you can find out more.
Great. So when you're looking at these different funding opportunities that Kenneth described, there are some great questions that you can ask yourself to really find what's the best fit for you and your programs. So the first is, how is your program that you're looking to get funded filling a gap? What makes it unique, and where is the need in the community in which you serve, and how is what you're doing fitting that need? What are some, in addition to that, what are some gaps in your funding and your budget that you're looking to fill? Where could you use a little extra capacity to make your programs even better or to serve an even larger population? Asking yourself which of your programs need funding or what could be improved with funding. So when you're looking for funding, you don't always need to be creating a new program. You can look at what already exists, what you already have established, and what can be grown or enhanced just with a little extra capacity. So as you're looking at those notice of funding opportunities, does your program fit within the grant priorities? Just like Kenneth said, it's really important to ask yourself if you're a fit rather than changing what you are or what you do or your mission just to be a fit. I love to ask this question when I'm looking at a funding opportunity. If the funding opportunity has been offered in prior years, which programs were funded? This is really helpful because you'll be able to look on the websites, you'll be able to see what those organizations did with their funding, you'll be able to see what their strategies were, and that kind of helps you to create your own narrative and see how you might fit in with what's already been done. Asking yourself, what is our capacity to utilize this funding within the timing requirements? So is the funds that we're asking for realistic with our staff capacity, with our time capacity to really utilize to the greatest potential within the time limits of this grant funding? Asking yourself, could your program be broken into phases? So maybe if you're looking at your capacity and you're saying, oh, we really want to create this program and we want to serve 40 youth or 40 adults, but within 12 months, is 40 really realistic? Can we really help them or serve them to the best of our ability? And maybe the answer is no, but maybe it's okay, but let's pilot this program, or let's try this program out first on a smaller scale, and let's try to help 20 adults this year, and then increase to 40 next year. So it's okay to ask for funding for parts of programs or to help part of a population to start off as well. And then finally, how will your program continue once your grant funding ends? And we'll talk about this a bit later when we look at sustainability. But when this grant funding ends at the end of next year or the following year, how will you keep serving the population that you're serving? And that goes with the question we just talked about of if you're looking to serve 40 youth over the course of 5 years and you're looking for funding to help 20 in the first 2 years, well, how will you help those additional 20 once this funding ends? And where will you find the funding to fill in those gaps? Okay. So I'm going to share my screen here. So just give me a second to pull this up. We are going to look through a sample notice of funding opportunity and discuss reviewing it. So you should see a notice of funding opportunity on my screen. Sarah, could you nod if you see that? Okay, awesome, great. So I am also pulling up the slide. So you won't be able to see the slide, but I'm going through each of the bullets on the slide that you just saw. So we're not missing anything, I promise. So this is the JTED NOFO, which is out currently. And we're just going to go through an idea of how you might read a NOFO like this, because it's not uncommon. As you'll see, this notice of funding opportunity is about 62 pages. That's not uncommon. And there is, I've found, a strategy to read through these in a way that doesn't feel quite as overwhelming. So the first place I always start is with the program description, and that might be on the first or second page. As you'll see, this first page has a table that overviews the grant. And so then I go right to the program description and I learn, why did this program come to be? What's the background and what are some of the requirements? So I might not do a super close read of this, but I start to scan it just so I have an idea of why this funding is available and what is exactly available. The next thing I'll do is I just control F. I just kind of search throughout the NOFO and I find that it's a lot easier to find what I'm looking for that way. So the next thing I'm going to type in is eligibility, because I want to find out whether or not my entity or organization is actually eligible. So I had already found this in advance and written down the page, and I found that it starts on page 16. So I'm just going to see what sorts of organizations are eligible. What do I need to acquire to be eligible? So like here it says I need a DUNS number and a SAM account, which we'll go over a little bit later. And then it goes into details regarding eligible applicants and cost sharing. So I'm going to read this really closely because before I read through all 62 pages, I want to see that I'm even eligible first. So once I've looked at the program description and I can verify that I'm eligible, the next thing I'm going to do is look for the application information and learn what is required as part of the application, which on this is on page 19. So as you see, there's a section called Application and Submission Information, and it describes the content and forms that are a part of applying. What this over, and I'm not only looking it over just to learn what's required, but also to sort of start to think in my head, who might handle the different parts of this application process? And also, do we have the time and capacity for it? Because that's a really important question. I've now reviewed the program description, I've confirmed I'm eligible, and I understand the application requirements and the deadlines. So next I'm going to look at the program requirements. What exactly are they looking for in the programs that are applying to this grant funding opportunity? So up here, I would have just typed in program into the search box. Again, I pre-read this. I already know the page numbers, but if you were doing this, you could just search program. So here it describes the program eligibility criteria. And this is what Kenneth was talking about earlier. It's really important to look for funding opportunities that are a fit with your programs, or, and in reverse too, looking for funding opportunities are looking for programs that fit with what they're looking for, versus trying to change your mission and change your program, because then every time you look for funding, you're changing what you do, and that actually makes finding funding a lot harder. So again, just making sure that you're a fit with what their program eligibility is described as. And once I've confirmed that I can apply and my program meets the requirements, I'm next going to look at finally the application review information. I want to know how my application is going to be reviewed, what's most important, and what those reviewers are really looking at. So here they have on page 24 application review information. So there's the criteria, but what's especially important that I like to look at is what percentage they give to each portion of the application. So how they weigh the importance of each form I'm submitting, each portion of my program I'm describing. So as you can see here, they really look at your capacity, but they're going to look at your documentation of need a little bit more. They're going to put a little bit of more weight on it. So why is your program necessary and needed? And then even more so than both of those is the quality of your program plan, which is again, looking at your capacity, looking at how well you have your program laid out, and how many people you're looking to serve and in what process, and looking to see that you've really thought some of those things through. So once I've done all of that, I've looked at the program description, I've learned I'm eligible, I've looked at the application requirements, I've learned that my program is eligible, and I understand the application review information, and all of that fits and it all looks great, then I'll go through and I'll reread the entire NOFO and do a close read and send it to someone else in my organization to do a close read too. A story I've told in other sessions is that it doesn't hurt to have a couple of people in your organization read these. I was working on a funding opportunity once, and I had read it many times and thought I had a really good grasp on it. And then someone else read it and said, well, why aren't we asking questions? And I said, well, what do you mean? We can't contact them. And there had been a section in the NOFO that said, for technical assistance, contact this email address. And I had been making up answers to the questions that were probably incorrect. And the whole time I could have emailed the email that they had listed on the funding opportunity. And I only realized that after I asked someone else to read it. So the value in having two sets of eyes is really helpful. A few tips and tricks that piggyback on what we just described: reading the application and reading it again. Just like I said, it doesn't hurt to read it a few times. Making sure to pay attention to the deadlines. So some funding opportunities might require you to submit a letter of intent prior to application, looking for little details like that. And then telling yourself that the deadline for the application is actually sooner than is listed. That will only help you. If you tell yourself the application is due 24 to 48 hours before the actual due date, that accounts for any tech issues you have on your end. If you're having a hard time with the system, it eliminates a lot of the risk of waiting to submit until the last minute. So, and it's not uncommon for people to wait till the last minute to submit and then run into issues and not be able to get the help they need because it's 4:59 p.m. before a 5 p.m. deadline. Looking at those target population requirements. So, often NOFOs will say we're really looking to fund organizations that work with these specific populations, and making sure that those are populations that your organization does have the capacity and expertise to serve. Noting all eligibility requirements, because they're there for a reason. So if you fit 4 out of the 5 eligibility requirements, but they're mandatory, making sure that you're not applying unless you fit all 5. And then finally, look for a rubric. Just like in elementary school, when a teacher would write the directions for what they're looking for on a homework assignment, very similar. The funder knows what they're looking for as well, and they're not trying to trick you. They're not trying to fool you. The directions are there for a reason. So simply following them is going to get you really far. This is something that I really like to use. It's just an example. You can find what works best for you. It really helps when I'm looking at the requirements for a grant application to break down all of the required parts and then making sure I have timelines on those, as well as know who on my team is working with each different section. So here I just listed some of the sections that are required in a narrative, and then really specifically writing down which staff member will handle that. Maybe you're at an organization where that staff member is you for all sections. Maybe you're at an organization where there's a teammate you're working with, but just making sure that's clear and written down so there's not confusion. And I also, when I'm working on my timeline and my work plan for filling out a grant application, I'm looking at a date to have my draft done and then a final draft, because you're always going to want someone else to review, just to look for little things like grammar and spelling, but also ensure that you have all of the required components and your application makes sense. I would even suggest, if it's possible, if you have someone who's not as familiar with your programs, to read over your grant application, because having that fresh perspective will help you with understanding whether or not someone understands your mission and your purpose, because a lot of times your reviewers are not the people who are in it every day, your board members and your staff. And so that's really helpful. Let's see here. And then again, I also write in final approval. So it's important to know who at your organization needs to sign off on this before submission, whether that's you, whether that's an executive director or a board chair or president. The final 2 sections I have at the bottom are a date of discussion with your team. So if you're a grant writer and you're not part of the team that implements programs, it's a good idea to have a discussion with those case managers or those program leaders to get their perspective, because they'll be really key to implementing these programs when the funding happens, and they'll give you a good idea of what's realistic and what isn't. And then again, writing down your final submission date, which hopefully you do 24 hours before at least, and then writing down the staff responsible, just so there's not confusion at the last minute of like, I thought you submitted, but I thought you submitted, and then nothing gets submitted, because that would be really unfortunate after all of that work. Kenneth, I thought that you unmuted yourself. Did you want to add something? Okay. So I want to go over just a few little tools that I find really helpful as you're just starting to organize yourself around applying to a funding opportunity. The first idea that I wrote down was just to use a Google Drive. You could use Microsoft Teams, whatever your agency or organization uses to do collaborative sharing. And if you do a Google Doc, something that I learned the hard way is to make sure you're on suggestion mode, because if you're on editing mode, then you can't track changes. So again, that's just a little thing, but it's really helpful. And then I want to go over a few online resources. So I'm going to share my screen. You should see it. The first resource I want to share with you is Padlet, and I'll put these each in the chat box after I review them. Padlet is really helpful. It is basically an online sticky note board to share resources. So if you're pulling together different data pieces or different files that you're going to use in your application, this is a good place to keep it organized. And it's free. It's really quick to make an account. And I just started a really simple board for Grants 101. But let's say that I wanted to add our WIOA Grants 101 page that I mentioned earlier. All I'd have to do is click plus and then add the link. And then I could just write Grants 101. And then my team would see it here. And this can be a little bit easier or more organized than email, because then you're not getting everything sort of lost in your email chain. I want to show you a board that I already have completed from another class. So here's one that I had from another presentation we did, and here's an example of a more complete board. So Padlet is one idea. The next idea I have is Slack, and Slack is very similar to Microsoft Teams. So I'm going to sign in to my Slack really quickly so that you can see the one that I created for Grants 101. And basically Slack is a way for you to talk similar to messaging with your team. And I'm sorry, it's my computer reset today and it looks like it kicked me out of Slack. So I can't log in at the moment, but I'll describe to you what it is. And basically Slack is, like I said, it's like Teams. You can post documents in it, you can chat. So if you're looking, again, if you're working on a document collaboratively, you can upload the document into Slack. And so everyone can see the most recent version versus, again, those getting kind of lost in email. And I'll send you a link to Slack. And then the final resource I have is Canva, and this isn't necessarily just grant specific. This could be used if you're doing programs at your organization to implement the grant, but this is just a place with online templates and they're pre-designed. So you're not always, grants will lay out exactly the format that they want their application in, so follow those. But if you're implementing programs as part of your funding and you're looking for some help with the graphic design piece, this is a free tool with templates already laid out for you. So I will put each of those in the chat box in just a moment so that you have all of them.
All right, now we're going to move to step 2, the writing phase, as Molly puts those in the chat.
This is actually a document that's from a private foundation that releases grant opportunities, but we just wanted to share some of their tips because we felt they were really helpful and they summarized a lot of what we've been saying well. The first, which we're going to talk about with Kenneth a little bit later, is to provide a simple budget that balances. It's really important that when you're describing your funding needs, that it's balanced and that what you're stating in your narrative matches what's listed on the budget, and those numbers aren't different. You don't need to reinvent the wheel necessarily. It's okay to build capacity on something that you've already done. It's okay to show your past successes. You don't need to reinvent program after program just to get funding opportunities each time. Number 3 is share your work. Explain why you have the capacity. Explain your past successes. Make sure that your program impact matches funding priorities. That goes back to when we were reading the NOFO, making sure that what your program sets out to do matches the background, matches the program description, matches what your funder is looking to do. Your funder really wants to partner with you. They know and they recognize that, they're not always on the ground every day. They're not out there in the community to the same level that you are. And so they need you to be able to implement these programs. They can't do it all, just like you can't do it all. You need them to help with capacity. So it's really a partnership. Adhere to deadlines. You've heard that a million times for us. Make sure that you're submitting on the due date and making sure that you really follow that. I saw someone just posted in the chat, is there a way to get the slides? Yes, we will be posting the slides as well as the recording to this presentation on WorkNet in the next couple of days. So Sarah or Kenneth, could you post that link so that people have it for after the presentation, that they'll find this information?
Yep.
Okay, awesome.
Okay.
So again, we're hoping that this is like a refresh or a first time training for a lot of folks who are starting the grant application processes, the NOFO, Notice of Funding Opportunity, or RFP, Request for Proposal or Application. These are, again, some of the primary sections of the application. First one we're going to talk about is the executive summary. Basically, what we like to talk about the executive summary is as your power cover letter. Just as when you're applying for a job, you write a cover letter that shows off who you are and why you're a right fit for that particular job. The executive summary of a grant application should be who you are, what this program is about, why you matter. There are a couple of different ways of looking at the executive summary. One way is that it's a way to really show off and catch the reviewer's eyes. However, the most important thing is to realize, and this is a theme you'll hear throughout this presentation, you need to follow the instructions of what the application says your executive summary should include. Should it include just your basics of who you are, what you're doing? Or should it include the details of how many people you're going to serve, what this particular money will support? Just follow the instructions clearly. So basically, cover yourself, cover the application, cover something that will catch the reviewer's eye. Because again, as Molly said, sometimes the people who are not deeply involved in a project are the best people to review your executive summary. Have your partner, have your friends, have someone else in the agency read it to make sure it makes good sense. Back in many years ago, when I was working in HIV and addictions, we used terminology and acronyms that the people at the funding, especially at foundations, did not know. So having someone else read it and say, what does this mean, is a great opportunity for you to make sure your executive summary is clear. There are a few ways of doing this. One school of thought is to do your executive summary before you write your grant application. That's a great way to have it clear in your mind. Who are you? What are you doing? What are your mission? What are your goals? And that can be a nice way to help you stay on track as you write. The other school of thought is to write your executive summary after you've written the rest of the application. That way you can summarize and really put the bow on it to describe what everything is about. Both ways work. What's most important, however, is making sure that you revisit, go back and forth, read the application that you've completed and compare it with your executive summary to make sure that they match each other and that they really highlight the things that you want to highlight. Sell yourself in your executive summary without necessarily being too flowery and promising the world, because what's in the application needs to be clear. So, program information. This next section of the application is the meat of it. Who you are, what can you do, showing that the need is there in the community. We're going to cover each of these clearly, but it's all about the program information. How are you going to do what you plan to do? And what are those outcomes? What is the goal of what you're showing that you can do?
So the first section, in terms of applicant capacity, there are several questions that you can ask yourself and then that will also be asked of you. So as you're talking about your capacity and thinking about it, asking, who are you and what is your relationship to the target population? Why are you uniquely qualified and uniquely positioned to do this really important work? So asking again, what are some of your staff qualifications? Does your staff go through a certain training that makes them especially qualified? Have they participated in various programs? I know at the last homeless shelter that I worked at, we all went through a secondary trauma training, and that was required of all employees. We all became qualified to help individuals sign up for various health programs. So listing, even if they seem like just standard things that you always do, describing that, because they might not be, they might be unique to your organization. What other projects have you accomplished? So what have you already succeeded at in the past, or how have you already served people in the past that has worked well, that position you well to do this again? Who are your partners, whether that be other nonprofits, whether that be other organizations or other business partners? Who do you work with and how are you already collaborative? What are their qualifications? So if you refer all of if you refer all of the individuals that you serve to a certain agency or a certain program, how does that program help and assist the people you're working with? You can talk about different qualifications of specific individuals who will carry out these programs. So if there's one person who's your program director who will really be leading this project, talking about how they're prepared, and then listing the facilities and resources that you already have available and that you already have that will help and that you don't need to repurchase or recreate. Again, this documentation of need. And a question I really like to ask with this is, what will happen if our organization does not get funded? How will it impact our community if we don't receive this funding? And that's an important question for you to ask yourself and also for your funder to ask. So as you're asking yourself that, again, what is the target population and who will be served both demographically and geographically? And I want to highlight the geographic section because you may be located within a large city, but you may help a specific neighborhood, or you may be looking within a specific zip code. So highlighting that for the funder rather than being broad. So if you're in the city of Chicago, but you help one specific neighborhood, not just saying we serve the city of Chicago, but we serve this neighborhood within the city. What are the needs of the target population? And you might state these needs through surveys that you've conducted with the participants in your programs. This may come through quotes or qualitative information based on conversations or focus groups you've had. I would caution here that the needs that you're stating are really coming from your program participants or people who potentially will be participants, rather than those coming based on guesses from the people, the organization itself, really showing that those needs are backed up by the people utilizing your programs. What are the causes of this need? So was there, a natural disaster that displaced many people, or is there, a lack of job opportunity in the area you're in? Describing what the causes of I got my words really twisted up there. What the causes of are those needs? They're still twisted up, but you all know what I'm saying. I hope.
Got it. You're good, Molly.
There's a lot of adverbs all just right squished in there. Okay. Let's see here. So again, how do you know there is a need? That can be qualitative and quantitative data. That might be data that you receive from the census regarding demographic or economic information in your area. It could be coming from a local United Way. We'll talk about finding that data later. Again, why is it important that you receive this funding? And then, is this need already being addressed? So if it's already being addressed, it might actually be a better use of your time and resources to partner with someone who's already addressing the need, rather than recreate a duplicative program, because that's something that funders do not like to see, is that they're funding something that already exists where they could just build on something and add capacity to it if it's already working well. And then finally, only include the need or problem you intend to address. So if your organization has 15 different programs, but you're only applying for funding for one program, you don't need to highlight every single aspect of every single program if you're only applying for funding for one. So try to be specific and focused. This is a really helpful diagram when you're describing a documentation of need and thinking about how you might lay this out. You can start with a national need or trend. So let's say that we're looking at food insecurity. You might say nationally, here are some food insecurity statistics. In our state, this is how that is played out and reflected. And then locally, in our neighborhood, our city, our town, our village, this is how our need is demonstrated. And I think that's a really helpful way to break down a need and use that to create your need statement.
Thank you. So when we're talking about the operational plan or scope of work, it's all those things that Molly had just started hitting on. What is your solution? You've demonstrated that there's a need in your community, a need at your organization, but how will you approach it? How will you fix it? The plan of action is the step-by-step. What do you do? How long will it take? Who's going to do what? But really talking about then what's the goal? How will you get there? And again, tie it back to how does that solve the problem? If your solution to that food insecurity in your community is to start a farm, talk about that. Be specific. How does that address the issue? The one thing that's really that changes throughout time as far as how we present it is showing your measurable outcomes. A lot of people use what's called SMART objectives, where you talk about that things are specific, measurable. You talk about how you will get to your objective. But no matter what term you use, make sure it's the instructions that the funder tells you to use. They may want SMART goals. They may want just a table. Follow their guidance to show what the outcomes will be and the steps you take to get there. When you talk about that second to last bullet point, talking about how the project will be managed, In a minute, we're going to hit on your budget. This is critical. If someone specific will be overseeing this project, or if it will be a team, who that person is needs to show up in your budget later. All of these activities and steps to get to your goals and how your goals support the need and fix the problem need to show up somewhere else. Lay it all out, have those in mind so that when you piece together the other pieces, there's a story that's being told in every component of your application.
This is what Kenneth was just talking about. It's when we're looking at our outcomes and our performance measures, we can think of them in terms of goals. And as Kenneth mentioned, we can think of them as SMART goals: specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and timely. And these SMART goals can be used to create your work plan and your timeline. Your goals can be divided into smaller sub-goals even, and you can assign your staff to different timeline items or different goals to make sure that your work plan is really carried out. One item that we suggest is that you use titles, and it depends on what the application asks for. If the application asks for names, then by all means use names. It can be helpful to use titles of positions rather than names if it doesn't ask for it though, in case there is any turnover within your organization, you have a title versus a name. And then again, making sure that those work plan items can be related to that need statement that you created, and those align and are similar. This is a really helpful sheet for writing SMART objectives, and the source that we found it is below. So when you're writing a SMART objective or a SMART goal, you want to be specific. You want to describe exactly what you're looking to do, talk about who will be completing that task, and think about accountability. Something I think about here is, I took a resume writing class in high school, and they said it's much more powerful to write, for example, that let's say that you're in development. So I write grant applications for our organization. That's something that you could write. To make it more specific, you could write, I complete 15 grant applications each year, of which 8 were funded. So that's an example of making something specific. Making it measurable. So here they give an example of, instead of saying we're going to serve youth, you might put that we will serve 14 youth over the course of 15 days. That makes it more measurable. Attainable, again, looking at your capacity and making sure that you can attain these goals that you're creating, making them relevant, making sure those match your needs statement, and then time bound, which your grant funding is typically time bound by nature. Your funder will say this is funding to be used over 12 months or 18 months or 2 years. And so making sure, again, that your goals are falling in that time range. I have 2 work plans listed here as examples, and they're from various sources. This one is from a NOFO that was released a while ago. It's no longer active. It's from a pre-apprenticeship NOFO. Their implementation plan that they attached to their application was, I felt, really helpful. So here's an example. They ask you to list your activity, a timeline, the responsible staff, and the deliverable. So what will be the outcome? Maybe that might be, let's say that you're trying to make sure 15 students have meals for after school, then your deliverable will be 15 meals 5 days a week, for example. We have another example on the next slide, and sometimes these work plans or these program implementation plans are given to you as templates as part of the NOFO, so keep your eyes open for that as well. So this is another example, and this might be one that you keep more internal. It's a bit more detailed, but it's listing all of your activities and then writing which month throughout the year that activity will occur. What I really like to do when I'm using something like this is look at an agency or organization calendar. If you naturally know that December is your biggest fundraising month, you're doing your annual appeal, you're having an event, you're doing all of these different things, then you're probably not going to want to do the main ramp up of your grant funding in December. You'd want to push it to January. So really looking at this in comparison to your agency or organization calendar and already existing processes and programs. to talk about sustainability, and this is a really key important thing. How will you continue to implement different programs once this grant funding ends? Because funders really want to help and they want to see these programs happen, but they don't want them to happen once and then never happen again. That's not the goal either. Asking yourself, how will you continue or grow your program once that funding is complete? And that might happen through collaboration with other organizations, which could look like various aspects. It could mean that after a couple of years, you're merging or combining or collaborating with an organization that does something similar, and you're splitting the costs to make it a little more cost effective on both ends. It could look like you're applying to other grant funding opportunities after a couple of years. It could mean that you are doing some own individual fundraising at your organization level, but just making sure that you demonstrate to the funder that you've thought this through. I shared this in another TA session. I used to think that if we received funding from other sources, we should not list that in grant applications because it would make the funder think we don't need their funding because we already have some. I learned that is not true. This is not like a competitive game. It is helpful if you show that you actually partner with other organizations. It shows that you can have partnerships and you are reliable and you can implement funding successfully. So don't be afraid to demonstrate that you have a plan and you have some funding secured to continue this program. And then asking, is this a one-time project or a long-term project? And really describing that you've thought about that as well in your grant application so that your funder understands that. Here are a few things to consider, and these are going to vary based on the type of organization you are, the type of agency you are, what your nonprofit status is. So did my sound just get a little fuzzy?
But I think it's better now.
Better now? Okay, sorry about that. It sounded like I got too close to a speaker there. So again, this will depend on if you're a 501c3 or government agency or how you're classified. But some ideas are, if you're looking at sustainability, considering additional grant funding you may receive, considering your major donors. Do you have a major donor who would be willing to help fund this program when the grant funding ends or concurrently? Do you have a pledge program? I gave an example of I worked for an agency that wanted to house a certain number of people over about 5 years. And we were able to find individuals to pledge $1,000 a year for 5 years and then find an agency to match that. That's an idea. Additionally, will you partner with local foundations or local employers? Some employers do employee match programs if employees give a certain % of their paycheck to a nonprofit. So looking at other opportunities like that, again, depending on your status, your fundraising status as an organization.
So the next thing we're going to talk about a little bit are some of the forms that you will see on, at least for our purpose here, state funding opportunities, NOFOs. Again, no matter where you're looking at receiving funding, there'll be different forms, different processes, whether it's a government entity, a private foundation. So some of these forms are ones that we use. We're going to go through, you've already seen the NOFO that Molly has walked us through major parts of. The GATA. GATA is something that scares people. We'll cover that in just a second. Let's move on forward and we'll show you some of these forms that we use for the budget component. The reason we're covering forms specifically for the budget component, we should put big blinking lights on this first bullet point here. The budget is often the weakest part of an application. It can be the part that will unfortunately get a grant application thrown out. That will make the reviewers really question whether or not an entity should receive funding. It can be a part where the funder might come back and help and figure out and guide you, but often not. Sometimes if a reviewer or a funder sees that a budget is weak, it may cause so many red flags that the application is denied. So keep it simple. First of all, I want to make sure everyone knows that on the Illinois WorkNet website, we have a fabulous recorded TA sessions for budget and specifics on the GATA. So this presentation here is to give you just some basics so you feel comfortable and don't panic, which is what some new grant writers do when they get to the budget piece and say, I can't do this, it's overwhelming. So some main thoughts to think about. You've heard us say repeatedly, follow the instructions that are in the application NOFO, and realize that a well-planned and well-written budget just tells your story. Everything in the budget should be somewhere else in your application and vice versa. They drive each other. Your budget tells your story in dollar terms. Let's move forward because all of this will keep tying back together. Making sure you have a strong budget really just shows that your program is feasible. Is it realistic? Can it really be done for the amount of money you're asking for? Also showing that it's meaningful. I can think of a time when I'm talking about the bang for the buck, where agencies have applied for, multiple agencies applying for the same funding amount. One entity will do, let's say, $100,000 and service X number of participants. Another agency may ask for that same $100,000 and serve twice as many participants. Yeah, that big bang for the buck is what the reviewers really want to see, as long as it's clear why. Why can they do so many, or why can this one do so few? So making sure that it's a realistic, feasible bang for the buck. It also shows that you have responsibility. I've told a few times a story as a grant reviewer where I knew of an agency, small community, so many of us were reviewing applications for a service and entities that we were familiar with. And I saw on the budget that the executive director's salary was 100% in the budget. I knew that CEO was also getting paid through other entities. We knew there was some shysty business going on. Could have been a mistake, but it was enough to show us that the agency that was requesting this money wasn't responsible. They weren't showing integrity or carefulness when submitting their budgets. So showing your budget shows that you're responsible with the dollars you're going to get and that you're going to use the money for a good cause. Here's a really nice slide that shows 3 terms that helps bring all of that together. Allowable. Do the expenses that you're listing in your budget, do they all show up as allowable in the NOFO or the RFP, RFA? Do they fit in the guidelines? Making sure that everything you're requesting funding for is approved by the funder. Let's say, for instance, I wanted to pay for stipends for my program participants, but in the NOFO, it clearly says stipends are not allowed, or it's not listed as some of the examples. I could either ask for technical assistance, as Molly talked about earlier, if that's allowed, or realize it's not allowable, don't put it on there. You'll put it someplace else in the budget showing that you're paying for it elsewhere as an in-kind. But is it reasonable is the next one. So for instance, let's say we're talking about paying our interns. Is the salary or the stipend that we're planning to give to our interns a reasonable amount? Are we saying we're only going to give our interns a $5 wage when what's really reasonable for the community is minimum wage? Is it reasonable? Does it fit the normal activities? One thing that's really helpful with some funding applications is that there will be what's called a cost band, where the funder will say they expect that this type of service would fall within $5 and $15. It's a reasonable expectation. If you go above or beyond that reasonable allocation cost band, you might automatically be considered irresponsible. Something else that's really appropriate is whether or not something's allocable. Allocable simply means, is it specific to this award? Are you asking for help paying for something that cannot really be applied to this program? So will it help the program in general? Is it an indirect or a direct cost? Or is it something that really can be applied to a different funding stream or a different income stream? Here's some of those key terms that we've kind of thrown around. Just want to bring them back because, again, the purpose of this section of our presentation is to get you comfortable. When we're talking about a line item, it simply is that on the budget form, a specific line that indicates what the item, what the activity or service is, how much it costs. Discretionary, we talked about earlier, where it's free dollars that you can use to do what you need with. Matching, Molly talked about a certain type of matching earlier. This is different. In the main budget part, government entities in particular may say they will match, or they have a match requirement. That goes to showing that you have other funding streams. Often government entities will like to see that you have budget or you have income from another government entity. For instance, I once had a program where in order to receive healthcare dollars from the feds, I needed to show that I also had local healthcare dollars that were coming in from a government entity. And they would therefore allow, my new funding source would allow a certain amount of income to us based on what they could match with other income streams. Indirect and direct, we're going to cover in the next couple of slides here. This is something that panics a lot of grant writers. And again, go back to two things we keep saying: follow the instructions clearly and use a team as much as possible. As someone who was a program director for many years, whenever I was writing grant applications, I knew I was not the best person to do the budget. However, I was the best person to help guide the budget because I knew what we needed to make our program run. So working closely with your fiscal people at your agency, if you can, to help keep these two things clear. Direct costs are the things that I know directly impact the program. They can be specifically tied to a project. Let's say we want to do a training program for certified nurses assistants. Things that directly apply to that program might be the instructor for that program, the textbooks for the students, their uniforms. Those are things that are directly tied to the project. Indirect costs are, however, are things that are still necessary, but maybe don't go specifically to the project. For instance, let's say all of the students are coming into our building to take classes together. The facility that they're all coming into, maybe a portion of the facility can be covered by our budget, but not all of it. It's necessary, but we can't say specifically our building costs go toward this project. So there are things that are required, but not completely 100% tied to the project. It's not the nursing assistant books, but it might be part of the internet that we need in order to have the classes for those students. Don't get overwhelmed by it. It's just get familiar with those terms and make sure you're reading the description really carefully in the NOFO or the RFP. I see Sarah smiling because that's what happens when people write grants, especially new grant writers. We freak out on the budget parts, just like some of us do on our personal lives, and then make mistakes by not following the guideline carefully.
Yeah. And Tamika
Indirect
also
rate.
went through that.
Sorry?
Sorry, Kenneth. I was just
Yeah.
gonna say Tamika also went through this
Mhm.
information more in depthly in the GATA presentation, which is on WorkNet.
Yes. So this part is to help you get familiar and really listen carefully. In Tamika's presentation, she does a great job of talking about the federally negotiated process or using a different allowable indirect rate. So again, Tamika has covered this really well. Click on to our new saved recording. But this is to show you so you're comfortable. This is a sample state budget overview where there are different sections where you talk about the summary, how you included, how you determined your indirect cost rate. Section B is what you have. How much do you have? What is the value in cash of your entity? And what other services that in kind will you be able to use and can you leverage? All of these will show a couple more slides next. I believe Sarah's showing some of the forms. The budget, again, you're going to go through this carefully with every single application, but you have a line for everything that you're including. Your narrative on a lot of budget applications, this one doesn't have it as a separate column, but sometimes the budget applications will have a column where you can put your narrative and your word description of each line right there. That's a great way for newcomers in grant writing to really feel comfortable with making sure that their budget items match. So if you're filling out a budget application, my recommendation, a tip, if it doesn't have a column for you to include a narrative there on the budget form, make one for yourself where you just in words off to the right, make a little column and describe what each of those costs are about. Tell that story. All of it comes back to tying in who you are, what is the need, what is the problem, what are you planning on doing, and how does it fit? As someone who's done grant reviewing for many years, one thing that absolutely is disturbing is if suddenly when you get to the budget component, you see things on the line items that you didn't hear about in the narrative. Why suddenly now are we talking about supplies or an instructor or a new staff member that nowhere else in the narrative have we heard about? There's that misconnection, and you need to be able to tie everything together in your application process. It's huge. Just tell the story in dollars, tying it back to your budget narrative. Don't panic. That's the most important part. Follow the instructions and don't panic.
All right, and now we're on to phase 3, which is submitting your application. So I think we've said it at least once, is to pay attention to deadlines and turn it in on time and complete. That's a big one. Some agencies or foundations will not review grants that are late, so it's important to get yours in on time. That's why Molly mentioned scheduling the deadline a day before. Do not scan your application, save and send as a PDF. And as kind of a final activity, I'll show you how to do that with this presentation. Make sure all signatures are in order. That's just something, signatures are a big part of applications, to make sure you have sign off from your executive director or anybody a part of the program that the grant has requested. Just make sure those are all there. Add page numbers. As a person who's reviewed grants before, there's a lot of pages that go into an application. And if you're reviewing many, they can run together. So being able to know what page on which grant application did what is super helpful to people reviewing. Table of contents are also very helpful. If you can skip to a certain part that you're reviewing that day, it's going to make a reviewer a lot happier, and it's going to make your job and, Outlook a lot better too. And when in doubt, check on Grammarly. Grammarly is a website that will check for grammar and if a sentence makes sense. And we are big fans of it at DCEO. And do not alter the requested formatting. I know that it might be tempting to want to stand out from the crowd and put a different template on, or bold things and italicized things, or don't do that, because there's a reason that the funder has requested the formatting in a certain way. And it may not make sense to you, but when you're reviewing things and you have a lot of applications, keeping things in the same format is very helpful. So I'm going to show you how to save as a PDF. And Molly and Kenneth will have to let me know if they can see this. So I'm going to go to File and Save As. And can you all see this right now? Okay. So there's a little section down here that says File Format. And if I click it and I go down to PDF, that's it. It'll export as a PDF. It'll be easier to send and save as a PDF. And it'll make reviewers and probably the application submission process a little easier. And now I'm going to circle back to the beginning, and we'll see if there's any questions in the chat.
Awesome. Were there 2 slides at the end, Sarah, that talked about data sources?
Oh, you know what? Sorry, Molly.
No worries. Oh, awesome. Okay, I think it's just 1 or 2 slides. I don't remember, but we just wanted to share these with you really quickly. If you're looking for data, especially for your needs statement, you might want to look at the American Community Survey data, which is conducted by the US Census. The Bureau of Labor Statistics data has a lot of information regarding economic data within your regions. And even more so, you can also look at IDES, the Illinois Department of Employment Security. They have a data website as well, which will be Illinois specific. You can look at your local economic development organization. They often have employment data or economic need data for your region. You can use your own annual report to share information. And also that your local United Way office may have some needs statement information regarding your local area. And then these are just some resources that we discussed today, and just some resources for you to dive in a little deeper. So now I think we're at questions now. So please feel free to, raise your hand, put a question in the chat box, and we can answer those for you. Oh, do we already have the website on the chat box? I don't see it for the JTED recordings of these sessions.
I don't believe so, but I'll stop sharing and I will pop it into the chat right now.
Perfect. So what Sarah is popping into the chat is the website where this recording is, recordings for many other TA sessions we've hosted over the past couple of weeks, and additional information regarding the JTED NOFO. We also have an email that will go out to you in the next couple of days, which will have a survey for you to complete regarding this session. And if you've attended other sessions, you may have already gotten that email as well. Thanks, Sarah, for putting that in the chat box. I'm not seeing any other questions at the moment, so definitely, look at that link. It has tons of resources. It's a good place for you to start. And we're really glad that you came here and we got to talk grants with you for a little while this morning. Is there anything else, Sarah and Kenneth?
I don't believe so. I think Molly covered it. And just to reiterate, the GATA 101 is on the JTID link that's in the chat, and so is the budget information, and as well as some other really great TAs put on some great presenters if you want to check those out.
Awesome. All righty. Well, I hope everyone has a great rest of your Monday, and we will see you later. Have a good day. Bye.